The hush of a first-class cabin is supposed to feel like sanctuary. Leather seats gleam beneath soft lighting, crystal glasses wait to be filled, and the air smells faintly of polished wood and luxury. But when Caleb Monroe and his partner Adrian Frost stepped through the aisle, that hush twisted into something else. Their clothes were simple white t-shirts, blue jeans, clean sneakers, and a single backpack each slung across their shoulders. No tailored suits, no polished briefcase, no designer luggage dragging behind them. Just two men who wanted nothing more than a quiet flight from New York to Atlanta. Yet as soon as they lowered themselves into seats 2A and 2B, a ripple of disdain moved through the cabin like a wave breaking on glass. The first to speak was Janelle, the lead flight attendant. Her smile never touched her eyes. They dropped straight to the small rainbow pin fastened on Caleb's chest, and then she let out a short laugh meant to be cruel. "First class isn't a student lounge," she said, voice pitched for those nearby to hear. Her glance slid across Adrian and back to Caleb as though their presence was contamination. "You must have mistaken your boarding group." The insult cracked open a floodgate. Passengers whispered just loud enough for the words to cut through the steady hum of the engines waiting to start. "They don't belong here." Another voice, "Look at them cheap clothes, not first-class material." And then harsher figures, gay and broke, but pretending to play elite. Adrian shifted slightly in his seat, shoulders drawing inward as the sting of those words pressed against him. Caleb's fingers closed around his hand, a silent tether holding him steady. Neither man spoke. They sat in the thick silence, absorbing the weight of strangers' judgments. Strangers who measured their worth in leather shoes and designer labels. Every eye in the cabin turned toward them, not in welcome, but as though they were intruders who had somehow slipped past locked gates. Caleb's heart drummed, but not from shame. It came from something deeper, the memory of every sideways glance, every door closed in his face because of who he loved. Every time society told him he could not possibly belong in the places his own hard work had earned him. This cabin was no different. His hand tightened around Adrian's, not to seek comfort, but to give it. They would endure this storm together, no matter how the voices rose. Adrian tried to focus on the small details to steady himself, the stitching in the leather armrest, the faint vibration of the air conditioning, the sterile smile of a man across the aisle holding his champagne flute like a prop in a stage play. But the whispers only grew louder. Some passengers smirked without shame, some leaned across aisles to gawk, and others stared blankly ahead, pretending indifference yet offering no defense. For Caleb, it was the eyes that burned most. Eyes that dismissed him not only for the rainbow on his chest, but for the plain cotton against his skin. Eyes that measured worth by appearances and found him lacking. It was a judgment he had faced too many times to count, but here it struck with special cruelty because he had bought these seats fair and square, with money he had earned, for the man he loved, on a trip that should have been nothing more than ordinary. Yet nothing felt ordinary about the humiliation that filled the cabin like smoke. In that moment, he understood something. Unspoken prejudice often comes not in the form of shouting, but in the slow corrosion of dignity, in the curl of a smile that cuts deeper than any knife. The plane had not even left the ground, but already the journey had begun to etch itself into memory. Adrian lowered his gaze, as though hoping the floor could swallow them. Caleb lifted his chin higher, as though daring the world to try. Two men side by side, refusing to shift from seats they had every right to occupy, while strangers dissected their existence as though it were some kind of spectacle. And beneath that simmering silence, a truth emerged. Judgment reveals far more about the eyes that cast it than the souls it targets. Appearances can be deceiving, and kindness costs nothing but cruelty, always carries a debt. Stay with this story until the very end. What happened in the skies that day became more than humiliation. It became revelation. And if you are new here, make sure to follow Heart Story, because the stories we tell are reminders of resilience, justice, and the quiet power of standing your ground even when the world wants you to move. The cabin had barely settled into uneasy silence when Janelle returned, her expression sharpened into open hostility. She reached for the boarding passes resting on the tray table, snatched them up without permission, and examined them as if they were forged documents smuggled past security. The flimsy paper crinkled in her grip as she lifted it closer to the cabin lights, eyes narrowing, lips curling in amusement. Then, with a sudden motion, she slapped the folded passes back against Caleb's chest. The sound was sharp enough to cut through every whisper, the sting echoing far beyond the physical gesture. But Janelle was not finished. With practiced ease, she pulled her phone from her pocket, screen already glowing. She turned the lens toward Caleb and Adrian, her voice dripping with disdain. "Ladies and gentlemen, here's your entertainment for the evening," she announced. "A rainbow couple who think they deserve first class." The words were delivered not as an observation, but as a public indictment. Her live stream flickered into action, comments beginning to scroll across the screen as strangers from far beyond the cabin joined the mockery. Some laughed with her, some typed hearts of support, but the tone was clear. Humiliation was the spectacle, and Caleb and Adrian were its unwilling stars. The cabin grew tense. A few passengers chuckled quietly, nodding as if approving of Janelle's cruelty. Others avoided eye contact altogether, burying themselves in newspapers, magazines, or the glow of their tablets, unwilling to intervene. And then, as if the scene had not yet reached its breaking point, two uniformed security staff appeared at the entrance of the aisle. They had been summoned to enforce order, yet their presence only deepened the imbalance of power. "Please vacate the seats," one of them said sternly, though the words carried less authority than assumption, as though departure was not a request but a foregone conclusion. Their bodies filled the narrow space, casting shadows that made Caleb and Adrian appear even smaller in contrast. Adrian's pulse quickened. His instinct was to de-escalate, to retreat before the tension grew into something irreversible. He leaned close, voice barely audible above the hum of the cabin. "We should go, Caleb, before this gets worse." His tone carried worry, not surrender, but the plea was unmistakable. Caleb sat motionless. His hand remained steady, fingers pressed against the armrest as if anchoring himself into something larger than the leather seat beneath him. His eyes, once quiet, now burned with cold clarity. "If we leave," he murmured, so low only Adrian could hear, "we teach them that their contempt is stronger than our right to exist here, and we will be carrying that weight forever." The words were not anger, but resolve. He did not stand. He did not flinch. He allowed the silence to hold, long enough for the security staff to exchange uneasy glances, long enough for Janelle's mocking grin to falter ever so slightly. Around them, the cabin quivered between complicity and conscience, between those eager to see them dragged out and those frozen by their own fear of standing up. It was a tableau of modern cruelty technology used not to connect, but to amplify shame. Authority used not to protect, but to pressure. Silence wielded as a weapon sharper than any blade. And at its center sat two men, unwilling to bow, unwilling to let dignity be stripped so easily. What unfolded in that cabin was more than a dispute about seats. It was a mirror reflecting the casual cruelty that thrives when onlookers choose comfort over courage. A live stream may end when the camera turns off, but the damage it spreads lingers long after the screen goes dark. In that silence, every witness had a choice to reinforce prejudice with silence, or to break it with truth. Most chose silence. Caleb chose stillness, and in stillness, he revealed defiance. For in the face of humiliation, sometimes the greatest act of resistance is to remain seated, unshaken, refusing to yield. And it is in that refusal that dignity finds its sharpest voice, teaching the world that worth is not for strangers to measure, but for each soul to hold unbroken. The cabin, thick with tension, shifted again when Jenkins, the flight manager, strode down the aisle. His shoes struck the floor with deliberate authority, each step rehearsed to project control. The crowd of passengers leaned subtly toward him, some with relief, others with anticipation, as though he had arrived to restore a natural order they believed had been disturbed. He paused at the row where Caleb and Adrian remained seated, folding his hands behind his back, posture crisp. His tone was calm, professional on its surface, but every syllable carried the sting of assumption. "Gentlemen," Jenkins said, "first-class passengers usually present themselves differently. We have standards here, and when appearances raise questions, it is our duty to investigate." His eyes scanned their plain clothing like a scanner programmed to detect fraud, ignoring entirely the legitimacy of the boarding passes. Caleb's expression did not change. He reached into his backpack with slow precision, withdrew the ticket stubs and identification card, and placed them on the fold-out table in front of him. "Everything is in order," he said evenly. Jenkins picked them up, inspecting each as though searching for invisible ink, his thumb running along the edges with exaggerated care. He found nothing irregular, yet instead of handing them back, he hesitated. "I'll need to verify this further," Jenkins remarked, his voice carrying just loud enough for the cabin to overhear. Passengers exchanged murmurs, some nodding in quiet satisfaction as though their suspicions had been validated, others averting their gaze in discomfort. Caleb did not move. Instead, he slid a small object onto the table, its matte surface catching the overhead light. It was a sleek black business card, unmarked by decoration except for a discreet silver crest embossed in the corner. The gesture was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but its presence was undeniable. From the row just behind, Maria, seated in 3B, caught sight of the card. Her breath hitched. Her eyes widened in recognition, lips parting as though she had seen a ghost. She leaned slightly forward, whispering to herself words no one else could hear, the disbelief etched across her face more powerful than any exclamation. Jenkins faltered. Just for a moment, his fingers twitched as he looked between the card and Caleb, suspicion fighting with a flicker of unease. But he quickly masked it, straightening his tie, pretending composure. "Regardless," he continued, "until we can confirm everything, I ask that you remain patient. We cannot allow disruptions in this cabin." The words landed like a verdict. A calculated delay meant not to uphold order, but to preserve hierarchy. Caleb's silence was heavier than speech. Adrian placed his hand gently on Caleb's shoulder, the gesture not of restraint, but of affirmation, as though signaling the moment had come. Around the Mausong, the air thickened. The crowd, sensing the stakes had risen, leaned closer. Janelle lingered nearby, her phone still angled discreetly, hungry for the climax of a spectacle she believed belonged to her. The security staff remained at attention, uncertain whether to act or to wait. And in the midst of it all, Caleb sat unmoved, a storm gathering behind his still eyes, while Adrian's quiet touch marked the threshold between patience and revelation. The confrontation had become more than a dispute over seats. It was the collision of perception and truth, of bias hiding behind rules and dignity, refusing to bow. The passengers, unwitting witnesses, were now participants in a silent trial, each one complicit by the verdict of their silence. And as Maria's eyes lingered on the black card, trembling at the recognition of what it represented, the fragile balance of the cabin prepared to shatter. Moments like these reveal a truth rarely spoken. Prejudice often hides behind the veil of professionalism, dressed in policies and procedures, cloaked in civility. But civility without fairness is only another mask for cruelty. It is in the quiet defiance, in refusing to yield to the theater of false authority, that dignity holds its ground. Caleb's stillness was no longer about resisting humiliation. It was about teaching everyone watching that appearances deceive, and truth always waits beneath the surface, ready to break through. The atmosphere in this cabin shifted again when the cockpit door opened and Captain Rodriguez emerged. His presence carried a weight that neither Janelle nor Jenkins could muster. The chatter dimmed as passengers watched him stride down the aisle, hat tucked neatly under his arm, authority radiating from every step. He stopped abruptly when his eyes fell on the black card still resting on the table. For a fraction of a second, the captain's composure faltered. His jaw tightened. His gaze darted from the card to Caleb's face, then back again. The recognition was immediate and unmistakable. This was not the look of a man confronting an unruly passenger. This was the look of someone realizing the entire power dynamic had shifted under his feet. Caleb rose slowly, his movements calm yet commanding. He slipped the card back into his pocket and met the captain's gaze head-on. Then, for the first time since boarding, his voice carried not just patience but authority. "Caleb Monroe," he said, his words measured and clear, "Chief Executive Officer of Monroe Aerospace. Our company supplies Skylink with 74 aircraft currently in service. I also hold a significant stake in Consolidated Airways, the parent group of this airline." The silence that followed was deafening. Every pair of eyes that had once judged him for plain cotton shirts and worn denim now dropped, as if afraid to meet his gaze. Faces that had smirked moments earlier grew rigid, their superiority collapsing beneath the weight of revelation. Janelle's live stream, still rolling, caught it all: the disdain, the taunting, the threats of removal, and now the undeniable truth. Her expression twisted as the audience online turned from spectators to critics, their comments flooding in faster than she could process. What she had framed as a performance of humiliation had transformed into evidence of bias and arrogance exposed in real time. Jenkins tried to speak, but the words stumbled out, stripped of authority. The facade of control he had worn like armor now cracked, leaving only the awkward shuffling of a man who realized he had been standing on a stage built of assumptions. Caleb did not need to raise his voice. He simply stood there, his presence filling the space with a kind of authority no uniform could replicate. "You did not question us because of procedure," he said evenly, his eyes sweeping across the cabin. "You questioned us because you saw two men you deemed unworthy, gay men, and worse in your eyes, men who wore nothing more than jeans and t-shirts." His words cut through the silence, not as anger but as fact, undeniable and precise. The passengers shifted uncomfortably, the weight of their earlier whispers pressing down like stones. The smirks had vanished, the sideways glances replaced by shame. What had begun as an attempt to force two travelers from their rightful seats had become a lesson in the danger of judging worth by appearances. The rainbow pin that had marked them for ridicule now gleamed in the light like a badge of resilience. For many watching, it was the moment they realized how quickly cruelty disguises itself as normalcy. It takes only one person with authority to strip others of dignity, and only one person with courage to reveal the truth. Caleb's calm unveiling was not just a defense of his seat, but a mirror held up to an entire cabin and to the world beyond, watching through a shaky live stream. The lesson lingered in the heavy air when judgment is built on surface. It collapses when faced with truth. And sometimes the simplest clothing conceals the greatest power, just as humility often carries the strength to unmask arrogance. The cabin remained suspended in stunned silence. For a moment it seemed the storm had broken, that Caleb's revelation as CEO had ended the spectacle. Every whisper had been silenced, every mocking glance forced downward. Passengers who once sneered now sat frozen, aware that their judgment had been streamed across the world. But just as the weight of the moment seemed to rest squarely on Caleb's shoulders, another shift was coming. Adrian, who until then had appeared only as the quiet companion, rose from his seat. His movements were deliberate, his face composed with a calm strength that seemed to radiate outward. He reached into his wallet and drew out a polished silver identification card. Its surface gleamed under the cabin lights, carrying words that reshaped the scene yet again: Washington Civil Rights Foundation, Chief Legal Counsel. His voice, steady and resolute, cut through the silence. "Adrian Frost," he announced, his tone neither boastful nor harsh. "General Counsel, Washington Civil Rights Foundation." The reaction was immediate. Gasps broke across the rows. Maria's hand flew to her mouth. Passengers who had been streaming the humiliation whispered to their phones in disbelief, narrating what had become a story no one could have predicted. The live stream comments exploded, not with ridicule this time, but with awe. The CEO and the civil rights lawyer, together, Janelle staggered back a step, her phone trembling as she realized the final blow had landed squarely on her. The uniform that had given her false power could no longer shield her from accountability. Adrian's gaze fixed on her with the unflinching certainty of law itself. "You should prepare for more than losing your job," he said firmly. "You should prepare to answer for violating federal civil rights protections." The words landed heavier than any insult. This was no longer just a dispute about tickets, nor even a humiliation turned inside out. It was now a legal reckoning, declared openly in front of an entire cabin of witnesses and broadcast live to thousands watching across the world. Applause erupted, hesitant at first, then building into thunder that filled the aircraft. A man in the back row wiped at his eyes, overcome by the sight of power wielded not to dominate, but to defend. "Finally," he whispered, voice breaking. "Someone stood up for us." Caleb and Adrian exchanged a glance that spoke louder than words. Together they had turned prejudice into proof, mockery into revelation. One carried the weight of industry and finance. The other carried the force of law. Separate, they might have been dismissed. Together, they were unassailable, a union of love and authority that no system could easily deny. The aircraft would not depart on time that night. Procedures would be delayed, reports would be written, reputations would unravel. But what lingered far beyond the walls of that cabin was the story of two men underestimated for their simplicity, ridiculed for who they were, and revealed to be both the backbone of the airline and the shield of justice itself. The rainbow pin still gleamed on Caleb's shirt, but now it symbolized far more than identity. It symbolized the truth that dignity cannot be erased by appearance, and that sometimes the most unassuming travelers carry the power to change entire systems. The world would remember that night not as a flight delayed, but as a reckoning broadcast live. And the question echoing through the cabin would soon echo beyond: what kind of world do we build when we judge people not by what they wear or who they love, but by the truth of what they stand for? What about you if you had been on that flight? Would you have stayed silent, or would you have stood up? Share your thoughts below. And don't forget to follow Heart Stories for more stories that remind us how love and justice can rewrite the ending no one expected.